talk, which is about AI and human resource management. And I'm really excited to give this talk because it's new, and as an ADHDer, I love new things. I'm going to talk you through 4 fundamental problems that we need to get over before we can be reliably using AI in HR, okay? And then I'm going to talk you through 5 checks that every business needs to make before they start using AI for HR. And then I'm going to tell you what ChatGPT said when I asked that thing, whatever it is, what 5 checks you should make before doing AI. And then we're going to mark GPT's paper and decide whether we think it was good enough or not. In order to explain to you what the fundamental problems are with AI, the first thing I need to explain to you is what the normal distribution is. The normal distribution is this weird thing, which is that it pretty much doesn't matter what you're measuring human beings on. If you plot their measurements on a graph, this is what it will look like. So this is the number of people going up the top, and then whatever measurement you've got, imagine you've got low on that side and high on that side, and most people will be in this big bulge in the middle, which is called the norm. So that's the norm. In case you've been wondering what it was, that's it. That is the norm. The norm is that most people will score similar to the average on most things. So for example, this is the height of adult males in the US. So this is and if you plot the height of adult males in the US, this is what it looks like on a graph. If you plot intelligence on a graph, this is what it looks like. So the majority of people are scoring around 100, somewhere between 85 and 115, and then fewer people are scoring either side of that. If you plot the normal distribution of voters, it looks like this. If you plot the normal distribution of personality, it looks like this. The whole of AI is based on this assumption. So it's based on the idea that provided we are measuring something that is, that is a population, most people who click on 1, the majority of people who clicked on 1 will then choose A. The majority, that normal distribution. The majority of people who clicked on 2 will choose B. The people who were in this group had X and Y, and therefore we will look for X and Y. And these kind of minute decisions are what all of AI is based on. They're based on the idea that if you do one thing, the majority, the norm that happens next is this. Like big data and machine learning, what you're actually hearing is calculations like that, replicated at scale, at speed. They're making inferences, they're making connections, and they're making inferences from the variables, which may not be able to tell the story, but the machine does not know this. The machine is going, people who did this also do, most of them do this, most of them. Can you see where my problem is going to come from? Let's start with problem 1. That's a big problem, and I'm glad that some of you are foreseeing what it's going to be. But before we even get there, problem 1 is that correlation is not causality. Hands up who remembers the headlines that 1 glass of wine a day prevents heart disease. Anyone remember that? Yeah? Oh, it was great, wasn't it? For about 5 minutes. And we all went, yes! Sadly, this is not a case of causality. I know, right? So that 1 glass of red wine is probably not the thing that is lowering heart disease, let's be honest. What's lowering the heart disease is the fact that we're talking about people who have 1 glass of wine a day, not people who have 2 or 3 or It also signals that that person is probably having a sociable meal, and they've probably therefore got some kind of social support, which we also know is incredibly protective of heart disease. They're probably also sitting down to that meal, and they probably have a reasonable income, both of which are also really helpful for preventing heart disease. So in other words, the correlation is 1 glass of wine equals less heart disease, which is what your machine would necessarily, that's the kind of thing machines are really good at understanding. But actually we've got all of these things that psychologists call extraneous variables, things that we haven't measured, things that we haven't got data for, and we cannot assume that that correlation between the 1 glass of wine is causing the lower heart disease, because there's all these other factors that we didn't put into the numbers. They're not in the spreadsheet, and therefore the machine doesn't know that they even exist. Problem 2 is unusual people. Those of you were going to get that. Hands up if you were going to get that. Yeah, you saw that coming, right? So the problem is, if this equals this for most people, in any normal distribution, around a third of people will not be catered for. The people that are scoring low and the people that are scoring high. are not being catered for in any machine learning process, because it is all based on statistics that are all based on the normal distribution. That is a big problem for any minoritized population, okay, or unusual people. Problem 3 is that there are population differences. So I'm showing you the normal distribution of height for men, and I'm also showing you the normal distribution of height for women. So what happens when we've created an AI based on a population that we think is normal, and actually we didn't have enough women in that population, or we were only measuring people from a low socioeconomic background and not people who had access to more resources when they were growing up. Are those populations the same? Do they have the same curve? Have we got enough variety in our population in order to predict if one happens, A will happen? The other problem, this is a bit more like the wine, is the problem of the good employee. We've got all of the extraneous variables. So if we are measuring performance, if we are making hiring decisions, promotion decisions based on data from an AI set, how do we know that that AI has captured all of the data? Not everything that an employee does can be measured. So for example, if you are Jolly Good Company, if you are like Jackie Wallace, my dear colleague, is over there, Jolly Good Company, absolutely Jolly Good Company. If you are good at reassuring other people in a crisis, or stepping in with no notice at all. If you are good at finding errors in a process that other people have missed and might be building efficiencies, HR software might not be capturing the right metrics to assess your worth, leading to bad decisions on making promotions and redundancies. So, I did a bit of research on this. These are the things you need to be thinking about before you go hell for leather into buying AI for HR. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is, do you have a governance framework? So are you bringing this in without a framework to govern it? Who's going to be making the decisions about what the AI is used for and whose data it is collecting? To what kind of principles do those people ascribe? Are they putting principles into their AI utilisation strategy? Are they clued up to ensure that the responsibility for GDPR, the Equality Act, compliance falls on the vendor, not the purchaser? So the question, Susan Scott Parker, who is one of my mentors in life, who is a disability activist, the question she asks is, how do you lip read a robot? So if you are using AI for video interviewing, how do you lip read that? What happens to people that have facial disfigurement? What happens to people who have tics? What happens to people who are autistic and don't make the same facial expressions as your AI might be expecting? What happens to people who come from cultures where eye contact works in a very different way to the way that your AI has been set up? So all of these things put you at massive risk of Equality Act compliance, and you also need to be really thinking about the data. So somebody needs to be thinking about those things. Those are big, gnarly problems. There is case law happening right now. Someone is taking Workday to court in the US for for their software failing to give him a job. So the case law on this is actually kind of rolling in quite nicely, isn't it? From the previous talk into this talk, I quite like that. So that's your first question, is do you have governance? And if you don't have governance, don't do it. You do not have the skills you need to purchase AI if you don't understand the normal distribution and you don't understand any of those things. Number 2, how good is your training data? So hands up who's heard the story about the Amazon hiring AI that taught itself to be sexist? Anyone? Oh, not enough. Okay, you're gonna like this one. All right. Okay. So it's quite famous. If you go Google this, you'll find it. I put there a link, so anyone that's got my slide, you can just click that, and that's the link. So basically, Amazon trained a hiring AI on existing staff performance and HR records. The hiring AI was screening CVs, resumes, to look for people that it should hire. And the training data that they gave the AI to learn what made a good employee at Amazon was the existing employees' staff records. And so the hiring AI started screening out women. Oh yes, no one told it to screen out women, but when you gave it the training data that showed that the leadership of Amazon was disproportionately male, it figured out all by its little old self that meant women were not necessarily the best people to employ. So it started screening out female CVs, anything that had an obvious the Women's Tennis Club or the Ladies Debating Society or whatever you have on your CVs. Equally, when facial recognition software was being developed in the early 2000s, between 2000 and 2010, it was trained using the internet, just generally the internet. And facial recognition software has come in under an enormous amount of pressure and legal jeopardy for failing to differentiate between black faces and brown faces. Now, in the period when it was being trained, there were more images of George Bush on the internet than any black women at all. Yes, that is why facial recognition software is so bad. So that's your second question. Where, when you're buying it, where did they get their training data? How did the machine learn to do what it does? Was it given training data that is adequate? Was it given training data that will actually teach it to understand the normal distribution, or is it looking at a biased population of just men, just women, just white people, just able-bodied people? Question 3, will there be a transfer issue? Now this is where your GDPR stuff comes in. So Xerox collected data on commuting times and linked it to retention and found that those living closer to the office were less likely to leave. But this is not benign because house prices were higher closer to town. So the AI inadvertently built a privilege loop into the system. And that's because it was basically making causality assumptions from correlationary data. So think about HR data that collects medical information, age information, demographic data. Let's say you're doing something lovely like a wellness initiative. Can you ring fence it and it only gets used for that? Or does it start making guesses about other things? So actually that commuting time, when Xerox were collecting it, they weren't collecting it to look at retention, they were collecting it to look at well-being. And the AI found the retention connection itself and started feeding back the retention connection. So are you buying something that will do that without your permission, or do you know that it has some hard stops in there that you haven't given permission for? Does that make sense? You've got to be sure about that. Question 4, can you explain the decisions that the AI is making? So if you are making performance, promotion or leaving decisions based on AI, can you justify that? Can you justify the decisions that AI makes about resources? Do you know what's happening in there? Do you know how it's doing it? And this is where this case, so Mobley versus Workday in the USA right now, Mr. Mobley is a man who is alleging race, age and disability discrimination against Workday. Workday are an HR solution provider, in case you haven't heard of them. And he applied to 80 to 100, I can't remember, it's between 80 and 100 job applications and didn't get any. And they were all mostly using Workday's interview process. And so he is, he's brought the case against Workday, but I want you to think back to that governance decision. So that means that all the companies that he applied to had got decent contracts with Workday that made it very clear if there was a problem, it was on Workday, not on the employer. What do you think the Workday solicitors are going to start building into their contracts now, having had that case? Yeah, who's going to be open to the liability if it goes wrong? It's not going to be Workday anymore, is it? No, they're smarter than that. So do you have the governance structures to check the contracts of the AI that you're buying and make sure that if they haven't programmed it with enough training data, that you won't be held liable in a court of law for failing to be inclusive? The last question is, are humans in the loop, on the loop, or out of the loop? So at what point can a human intervene in a process? So let's use the disability and the neurodiversity question. So if you are using an AI for recruitment and somebody goes online and they need a disability adjustment, are humans in the loop? Can you get a human into the loop to sort that out? Are they on the loop? Are they checking it occasionally? You might not get someone directly, but someone will go through every now and again and find those people and circle back. Or are they out of the loop? In other words, there is no way to get in there to ask for a reasonable adjustment if you need one in the hiring process. And this must be calculated against the risk of the decision for human harm or legal jeopardy. And on-balance assessments must be part of the governance structure. So you see why I said at the very beginning, do you have the governance in place? Who is making these decisions and how? So the question is, can the numbers actually speak for themselves? And the answer is no. Numbers do not speak for themselves. Data and data sets are not objective because they come from human design, and we make inferences and interpretations. Hidden biases exist in data collection and can skew the results with disastrous consequences. And there's two examples. So number one, the example of Hurricane Sandy. Does everyone remember that? The US emergency services were trying to work out where to send resources in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, and they were using Twitter data. What do you think is the difference in Twitter volume posting about Hurricane Sandy between Manhattan and the poorer parts of New York and the places like Far Rockaway? And yeah, absolutely. So it's skewed data. They're sending the resources where they're getting Twitter action, but Manhattan, with all its tall buildings, has got more people using Twitter than Far Rockaway, which actually had a worse impact and people were dying. There's also the Boston potholes. So in Boston, the city council created an app where you could report your potholes. You just took a picture of them, and they get 20,000 potholes a year in Boston because of their weather. So they were using this app to sort of save them time finding the potholes. Except guess who had the time and the smartphone and the IT capacity to use the app to tell you where the potholes were. So this is why we always have to be really, really clear before we start using AI for anything. So the question is, can the numbers actually speak for themselves? I got into a real argument about this with a very good numbers do not speak. Who worked in IT, data and data sets, and he was all excited about ChatGPT and make inferences. And he said you should ask ChatGPT exist in data collection and skew the results with disastrous consequences. And there's two examples. So I started trying to make a Sandy. Everyone remember that? The US emergency services were trying to work out where to send resources in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, and they were using Twitter data because I was already out. What do you think is the difference in Twitter volume posting about Hurricane? He asked a question between Manhattan and the poorer parts. I asked it for 5 places like it didn't do too badly. And so I just want to tell you what absolutely. So I got into a real argument about sending the resources. A very good friend, Twitter action, who worked in IT for buildings. And he was all excited about ChatGPT, which actually had a worse impact. And he said, you should ask ChatGPT. There's also the Boston potholes. So in Boston, the city council created an app where you could report potholes. I could. So I started trying to, and they get 20,000 potholes. I'm already out. I'm already out. So as a result, I can tell you, ChatGPT, the potholes not using, except guess who had the time? And I was already at the IT capacity to use the app to tell you where the potholes were. He asked, so this is why we always have to. And I asked it for 5 checks. It didn't do too bad before we start using. So I just want to tell you what ChatGPT. So first of all, it says assess the need, identify specific HR processes that could benefit from AI, such as recruitment, retention, performance evaluation. I'm out with performance evaluation. I don't think you can do that with AI. Determine if AI is the best solution for these processes and if there are any other alternatives. Then it said, and I like this one, evaluate the data. Check that the data that will be used to train the AI is accurate, representative, and unbiased. If the data is biased, the AI system will learn and perpetuate that bias, leading to potential discriminatory outcomes. It then said evaluate the algorithms and check that they are transparent, fair, and free from bias. Making sure that they're not basing decisions on discriminatory factors such as race, gender, or age. It said we have to comply with regulations. It mentioned GDPR and it mentioned equal opportunity, employment opportunities. And it also recommended that you check with legal experts. Not too bad. Test and monitor. The 5th check is to test and monitor the AI system once it's implemented, and test it in a controlled environment to make sure it's producing accurate results and monitoring any potential negative impacts, and make sure it has a plan in place for addressing any issues that arise. So I call that a low pass. I'm giving that a low pass. I'm definitely not giving it a distinction. So it described planning, checking, and reviewing. It understood that there needed to be good training data and that biased data was possible. It knew it had to have explicability and transparency. However, it didn't identify that planning, checking and reviewing should be part of a specific governance framework with accountability. It missed transfer issues and scope creep. So it totally missed that idea that you actually have to ring fence it. And if you're looking at commuting times for well-being, you can't then allow that same data to be used to predict things like retention, because that is bang out of order. So it didn't identify that. It assumes there will be sufficient training data. So it assumes that people will be online. It's making the assumption that people will be online. So it missed the thing that happened with the Boston potholes and Hurricane Sandy, which is not everybody has a smartphone and not everybody has time to faff around taking pictures of potholes. And actually some people are too busy trying to bail out their house to tweet about their flooding. So it missed that, I think, quite significantly. And it also missed the problem of the good employee. It missed the idea that some things can't be measured and aren't being measured. So it also didn't know, enough about which legislation required compliance. Do you know that if the internet were a country, it would be the third largest consumer of carbon in the world? And that the biggest consumer of carbon in the world is the USA. The second biggest consumer of carbon in the world is China. The third biggest consumer of carbon is the internet. And ChatGPT uses 80 times more carbon than Google. Now, how are you feeling about AI?